the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
So, Doctor, so many different areas we can pick it up on. Do you want to go through some of the presidents? You want to talk George Washington and make our way through? Do you want? All right. So let's maybe start with him. He's probably the most popular, most well known when it comes to the Revolution and everything else.
Yeah.
And we're looking at this man who really was the soul of the Republic at the time. But I'll let you take it from there and walk us through the first president.
So we've already been doing a lot of talking about George Washington, and I just published a little article on the Christian character of George Washington in Crisis Magazine, trying to kind of answer some of the questions that we've gotten online here on the radio. So people could take a look at that. But today, I think it would be good to wrap our heads around the fact that many of the men that we call the founding fathers also became president in the early years of the Republic. And so there's really a 50-year period, a very clear, striking 50-year period between 1776 and 1826, when all of the American presidents were also men who had signed the Declaration of Independence, participated in the Constitutional Convention. They had been involved in the Revolutionary War in some way. And so we really consider all of them founders. And so we had founders as presidents for a full 50 years of the early Republic. And so while George Washington stands out in his generation, and everyone called him the father of his fatherland, Pater Patriae in Latin, and we built the largest obelisk on planet Earth to his memory, nevertheless, he was not alone. And so it is good to kind of give our attention to this period of the early Republic when George Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and we shouldn't forget John Quincy Adams were presidents. We shouldn't forget John Quincy Adams because although he wasn't old enough to sign the Declaration of Independence, and he didn't participate in the Constitutional Convention, he did do early diplomatic work with his father during the Revolutionary War. He was very young, 12, 13, 14, and he was sent all the way to the court of the czar in Russia to try to get us a loan for the War of Independence. So John Quincy Adams, I think, has a kind of honorary role, among those presidents who were also present at the founding. And that gets us to 1826. Very strikingly in our history, in 1826, actually on the 4th of July, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day of the Declaration of Independence being promulgated, that was the day that both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died. Right. It's kind of an extraordinary, shall we call it coincidence or shall we call it providence, that both the man from the South, from Virginia, a slaveholder, Thomas Jefferson, and the man from the North of Puritan descent, whose family had come over on the Mayflower, John Adams, very abolitionist family, the Adamses in every generation, that they had both signed the Declaration of Independence, and when it came out on the 4th of July, 1776, and they died on the same day, 50 years later, which is really kind of an amazing story. In fact, the story goes that they had been corresponding ever since Jefferson's retirement. They had had a very controversial and bitter election between the two of them, and they stopped talking for a while. But through the good offices of Abigail Adams, God bless her, she brought them back together and convinced them to start correspondence. And so we actually have the Adams-Jefferson correspondence, all of their letters, ever since Jefferson retired from the presidency. And so they were kind of racing to see who would live longest. And they were kind of racing to see who would live longest because they had different interpretations of what had happened in 1776, different interpretations of the revolution. John Adams thought of the revolution as a conservative event that protected the English rights and liberties that we had already had in the colonies and that were being progressively taken away from us by the British Parliament. But Jefferson had a much more radical view of what happened in 1776, and he wasn't he wasn't averse to comparing the American Revolution to the French Revolution as a radical event. And so they really had different interpretations. And so they were kind of racing to the death to see whose interpretation would really, stay with the country moving forward. And so the story goes that John Adams, up at his house in Quincy, Massachusetts, was dying. And as he was dying, one of his last words were, "Jefferson still lives." When in fact, unbeknownst to him, Jefferson had died at Monticello in Virginia earlier that morning. But of course, they didn't even have telegraph wires back then, and so there was no way he could have known. So he died thinking he had been beaten by Thomas Jefferson, when in fact, Thomas Jefferson had died that morning. So that fact of those two deaths really gives us very neat portrait of the founding generation and the founders who became presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. Yeah. So it becomes a distinct period in our story, and it becomes, and I think we need to think about this because I think we do this naturally and we don't realize how peculiar it is to us as a nation, the way that we talk about the founders and the original intent of the founders. What was the original intent, right? The idea that we would keep going back to 1776, keep going back to 1788, keep going back to those founding documents and to the letters and to the time period, the history of the generation. What were their ideas about religious liberty? What was their original intent with regard to religious liberty? What is original intent with regard to slavery, right? But the very fact that we go back as a nation and do that, whatever our disagreements about their religious intent on a particular issue, the fact that that's even a feature of our thinking about our political regime, that we have very much a historical sense, that we want to be in some sense bound to the founders and the Constitution that they gave us and the spirit of 76, is a very striking feature of our own history. Abraham Lincoln always referred to them not as the founders, but he referred to them as the fathers. Right? And so he wanted to consult, what was the view of the fathers with regard to the issue of slavery, of course, all important at his time period. And that tendency in our national life to look back to our founding documents and back to the original intent of the founders is really a legacy of the John Adams presidency. Because at the very end of John Adams's presidency, it's often referred to as his midnight appointments to the Supreme Court, right? In that lame duck period after the November election and the January or, February inauguration, there's this kind of lame duck period where, the president is, aware that he's leaving office and he can take a couple of three-point shots, right? And John Adams's three-point shot was a series of midnight appointments to many federal courts, but also the appointment of John Marshall to the United States Supreme Court. And John Marshall, who is not usually included in our sort of Great Six list of American founders, John Marshall, as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, gave us a series of court decisions over the course of the presidencies of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. He lived very long, and he wrote, an enormous number of decisions, of Supreme Court decisions that really defined the role of the court and gave us the independent judiciary, sort of defined the independent judiciary and the Supreme Court's ability to do judicial review, to ask the question of whether a law that has been passed by the legislature is constitutional. And when you start to have that question a part of your history, is that constitutional? Is that law constitutional, right? that creates a whole mentality, gradually over the next 100, 200 years, it creates a whole mentality of having to consult back into our history. Look back at what did they mean by marriage in 1776? What was the original intent, the original definition of marriage? Male and female, right? It might not be written in the Constitution, but in that generation, in common law, that was the definition of marriage. This has created a very interesting dynamic, and John Marshall is central to that.